The silence in the house was the first thing he noticed every morning and the last thing he heard every night. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, empty silence, the kind that presses down on you, filling up all the space where laughter and conversation should be. He would wake up in a bed that was too big, in a room that was too white, and the only sound would be the soft hum of the air conditioning keeping the vast, sterile mansion at a perfect, cool temperature. He'd wander through the hallways, his footsteps echoing on the cold, polished marble floors. The sun would stream through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating expensive, uncomfortable furniture and abstract art on the walls that looked like someone had just thrown paint at a canvas and called it a day. It was a beautiful house, a showpiece, but it wasn't a home. It was a cage, just a very, very gilded one. He used to have a purpose. He used to have hands that created things, that brought music to life. He could still feel the ghost of it sometimes. The memory of his fingers dancing across ivory keys, the way a whole room could hold its breath to listen to a melody he was coaxing out of wood and wire. He remembered small, smoky bars where the air was thick with the smell of beer and ambition, and the applause was raw and real. He remembered the feeling of a worn-out piano key under his thumb, a little sticky, maybe, but full of character. That felt like a lifetime ago, a story about someone else he used to know. That man had dreams. This man just had a schedule. His days were a blur of emptiness. He'd work out in the gym for an hour, not because he enjoyed it, but because it filled a slot of time. He'd read books he couldn't focus on, his eyes scanning the words while his mind drifted back to a different time. He'd walk around the perfectly manicured garden, looking at flowers that were planted for their aesthetic value, not because anyone loved them. He was waiting, always waiting. Waiting for her to come home. His wife was a force of nature. She moved through the world with a confidence that he had long since lost. She was always busy, always on her phone, always planning the next event, the next trip, the next purchase. She collected things, art, cars, houses, and in a way she had collected him. He was handsome, well-spoken, and he looked good on her arm at parties. He was the quiet, artistic husband, a charming little detail in the story she told about herself. She didn't mean to be cruel, he thought. She just didn't see him anymore. Not really. She saw the polished surface, the accessory that completed her look, the evening of the dinner party. The house was transformed. The heavy silence was shattered by the clinking of glasses, the tinkle of forced laughter, and the low hum of a dozen conversations happening at once. He had spent an hour getting ready, putting on the expensive suit she had bought for him, the one that felt like a costume. He moved through the crowd with a practiced smile on his face, a glass of something he didn't want in his hand. He was good at playing the part. He nodded when people spoke to him, he laughed at jokes he didn't find funny, and he made sure his wife's glass was always full. He was a perfect host and a perfect stranger in his own home. He was standing near the massive fireplace, a structure so large and clean it looked like it had never been used, just listening to the swirl of conversations around him. A man he didn't know, a loud man with a red face and a booming voice, turned to him. "And you, my friend?" the man asked, clapping him on the shoulder a little too hard. "What is it you do?" "Eleanor tells us she's in finance, but she's been very quiet about you." He felt a familiar tightening in his chest. This was the moment he dreaded. The moment he had to define himself, and he had no good answer. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, about managing their properties or consulting, a vague title he'd invented to sound useful, but before he could speak he felt a light touch on his arm. His wife glided up to them, her smile dazzling, her eyes sparkling under the soft lights. She let out a little laugh, a sound like tiny bells. "Oh, don't ask him that, darling," she said to the man. But her eyes were on the rest of the small group that had now turned to listen. She gave his arm a playful, almost patronizing squeeze. "He doesn't do anything. Isn't that wonderful?" A few people chuckled politely. She continued, her voice full of a fondness that felt like a betrayal. "He used to have these cute little fantasies about being a concert pianist. Can you imagine? My little rock star." She leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, a picture of wifely affection. But he could feel the tension in her body, the subtle message that this was a performance for their guests. I told him he could just play for me at home. It's much more private that way. The group erupted in laughter. It wasn't mean laughter. It was the laughter of people who didn't know what else to do. It was the laughter of the comfortable, the laughter of those who had never had their dreams ground into dust and served as an amusing anecdote at a dinner party. He felt the heat rise in his neck, a hot, prickling wave of shame that washed over him. He could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of pity and amusement. He saw the way they looked at him, not as a man, but as a pet, a trinket his wife kept on a shelf. He looked down at his plate of food, the fancy little arrangement suddenly looking like ash in his mouth. His hands, which once held the power to make a room weep with a beautiful sonata, felt useless and limp at his sides. He wanted to disappear, to sink through the marble floor and into the earth below. He wanted to scream, but he just stood there, a statue carved from shame, and smiled his practiced, empty smile while his wife basked in the attention, telling the story of the man she owned. The laughter echoed in his ears, drowning out the memory of music, drowning out everything but the deafening, silent roar of his own humiliation. The laughter from the dinner party seemed to echo in the vast, empty rooms for days. It wasn't a real echo, of course. The house was too well built for that. But it was an echo in his mind, a constant, taunting reminder of his place in this world. He'd lie in bed at night, the space beside him cold and empty, and hear his wife's tinkling, cruel laugh. He'd see the faces of the strangers, their polite smiles hiding their pity. The words she had said played on a loop in his head. He doesn't do anything. Cute little fantasies. My little rock star. Each word was a tiny needle, and together they formed a blanket of shame he couldn't seem to shrug off. The days that followed were a gray blur. He went through his motions, the workout, the pointless walks in the garden, the hours spent staring at a book he wasn't reading. But the silence of the house felt different now. It wasn't just empty. It was accusatory. It seemed to ask him, "What are you going to do about it?" And he had no answer. He felt smaller than ever, a ghost haunting a life that wasn't his own. Then, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, as he was listlessly polishing a silver coffee table that never got used, his phone rang. The number was unknown, a local area code he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. A dry, professional voice on the other end asked for him by name. It was a lawyer, a man whose voice sounded like it was used to delivering bad news. The lawyer explained that his grandfather had passed away. A wave of cold washed over him. He hadn't spoken to his grandfather in nearly 10 years. The old man had been stern, demanding, a man who believed that music was a sacred calling, not a hobby. They had argued when he decided to give up his struggling musician life to marry his wife. His grandfather had called it a foolish choice, a betrayal of his gift. He had hung up on him, angry and proud, and never found the right time to call back. Now that time was gone forever. A heavy knot of guilt and regret tightened in his stomach, the lawyer continued, his voice devoid of emotion, explaining the contents of the will. The estate was meager, just a small, simple house filled with books and sheet music. There was no money to speak of. But there was one specific item, one thing his grandfather had left directly to him. He specified that his most prized possession was to be delivered to you, the lawyer said. It's an 80-year-old Steinway grand piano. He felt a strange jolt, a spark of something in the dead ash of his emotions. A piano, not just any piano, but the piano. The one he had learned on as a boy, the one his grandfather had played every single day until his hands became too stiff. He could almost smell the old wood and the faint scent of lemon oil his grandfather used to polish it. He could see the water rings on the side from countless glasses of tea. The slight discoloration on the ivory keys where his grandfather's fingers had rested for decades. That evening, he waited for his wife to come home. He felt a nervous energy he hadn't experienced in years. He paced the living room, his hands clammy. When she finally swept through the door, dropping her shopping bags on the floor and scrolling through her phone without a glance at him, he knew this was not going to be easy. There was a phone call today, he started, his voice a little shaky. Hmm? She murmured, not looking up from her screen. Was it the caterer? I told them I need a new menu for the Thompsons' gala. No, it was a lawyer. My grandfather passed away. She finally looked up, a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't sympathy, more like annoyance that he was interrupting her evening with something so inconvenient. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, I suppose. Were you too close? No, he admitted. Not at the end. Well, these things happen, she said, her attention already drifting back to her phone. Did he leave you anything? A little bit of land, maybe. We could use a new summer home. He left me his piano, he said, the words coming out more firmly than he expected. She looked up again, this time with a small, confused frown. His what? His piano. A Steinway Grand? A beat of silence. Then she let out a short, sharp laugh. It was the same laugh from the dinner party. You cannot be serious, she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. You are not bringing that thing into this house? It was his, he said, a quiet defiance rising in his chest. It's mine now. Absolutely not, she declared, putting her phone down and giving him her full attention, which felt more like a spotlight of judgment. We don't have room for that ancient monstrosity. It will be covered in dust, it will smell old, and it will completely clash with the decor. Have you seen this house? It's modern. It's clean. That thing is an antique and not in a good way. Just tell the lawyer to sell it. I'm sure it's worth a bit of money for scrap. It's not for sale, he said, his voice low but steady. He was surprised at his own courage. It felt like standing up for the first time after being knocked down for a decade. It's the only thing he had that meant anything to him. And it's the only thing I have from him. She stared at him, her eyes narrowed. She was not used to being contradicted. She saw the set of his jaw, the unfamiliar fire in his eyes. She realized this wasn't a small request. For a moment he thought she was going to fight him, to threaten him, to forbid it. But then a different look crossed her face. It was a look of calculation. She saw that this was important to him, and she decided to use it. Fine, she said with a dramatic sigh, picking up her phone again. Have your little piano? But it is not going in the main house. You can put it in the sunroom. The drafty annex. No one ever goes out there anyway. Just keep it out of my sight. It was a victory, but a hollow one. The sunroom was a small, glass-walled room on the far side of the house, connected to the garden. It was the least used space, often cold in the winter and too hot in the summer. It was a place for forgotten things. By sending the piano there, she was telling him that he and his past were also forgotten things. A week later, the piano arrived. Two burly movers struggled to carry the massive instrument through the pristine hallways, their scuffed boots a stark contrast to the gleaming floors. They grunted and sweated, maneuvering the dark, imposing piece of furniture towards the sunroom. His wife watched from the top of the grand staircase, a look of pure disgust on her face, as if they were hauling in a dead animal. When they were gone, he was left alone in the sunroom with the piano. It sat there, a giant from another world, completely out of place against the sleek glass and modern white walls. It was bigger than he remembered, a beautiful beast of dark, polished wood. It was covered in a fine layer of dust, and the ivory keys had yellowed with age. There were scratches on the side and small nicks in the wood, each one a memory, a story. He walked slowly towards it, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out and let his fingers rest on the cool, smooth wood. It felt real. It felt solid. It felt like a piece of his own soul he had long since given up on returned to him. He lifted the heavy lid, revealing the hammers and strings, the intricate machinery of a heart that had been silent for too long. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel like a ghost in his own life. He felt like he was finally home. For the first few days, the piano in the sunroom was just another piece of furniture, albeit a very large and out-of-place one. He would walk past the glass doors, glance at it, and quickly look away. It was like seeing a picture of an old friend you had a big fight with and never spoke to again. It brought up too many feelings. There was sadness, for sure, and a deep, aching nostalgia for the person he used to be. But there was also fear. A sharp, cold fear that maybe he had been wrong all along. Maybe his wife was right. Maybe it was just a cute little fantasy. What if he sat down to play and discovered that the magic was gone? What if his fingers were stiff and clumsy, and the music in his head had no way of getting out? That would be a final, undeniable proof of his failure. So he left it alone. The piano sat under the white cloth the movers had draped over it, a silent, shrouded ghost in the corner of the house. His wife, for her part, pretended it didn't exist. She never mentioned it. If she walked past the sunroom, she would pointedly look in the other direction. It was her way of controlling the situation, of showing him that this little rebellion of his was insignificant, a childish tantrum that she would patiently wait out. The silence from her was louder than any argument could have been. It was a message that said, "This thing you care about so much means nothing to me, and therefore it means nothing." A week passed. The memory of the dinner party had faded from a sharp, stabbing pain to a dull, constant throb in his chest. But one night it came back with a fresh wave of humiliation. He couldn't sleep. He lay in the vast, empty bed, staring at the ceiling, and all he could hear was her laughter, the polite chuckles of the strangers, and the sound of his own heart breaking. The house was too quiet. The silence was pressing in on him, suffocating him. He felt like he was drowning in it. He threw back the covers and got out of bed. He padded silently through the dark hallways, his bare feet making no sound on the cold floors. He wasn't sure where he was going, but his feet carried him towards the sunroom. He stood outside the glass doors, looking at the large, white shape in the moonlight. It looked like a sleeping beast. He slid the door open. The air in the room was cool and smelled of dust and the night. He walked over to the piano and with a deep breath pulled off the white cloth. The moonlight streaming through the windows caught the polished wood, making it gleam softly. It looked both beautiful and sad. He reached out and let his hand rest on the curved side of the piano. The wood was cool and smooth. He ran his fingers over it, feeling the small nicks and scratches, the imperfections that told a story. This was a real thing, a thing with a history, a thing that had lived a life. Unlike everything else in this house, which was new and perfect and empty, he sat down on the worn bench. It creaked under his weight. He hesitated for a long moment, his hands hovering over the keys. They felt like foreign objects attached to his wrists. Slowly, carefully, he lowered his fingers until they rested on the cool, yellowed ivory. He closed his eyes. He could almost feel his grandfather's presence next to him, a stern but encouraging voice in his ear. Feel the music. Don't just play the notes. He pressed a key. A single, lonely note filled the silent room. It was slightly out of tune, a little flat, but it was a sound. A real sound made by him. He pressed another, and then another. The notes were clumsy at first, his fingers fumbling, finding their footing after years of neglect. He started with a simple C major scale, the most basic exercise his grandfather had ever taught him. Up and then down. His fingers were stiff, slow to respond. It was frustrating. He felt like a child again, learning for the first time. But he didn't stop. He kept playing, his fingers slowly remembering the patterns, the muscle memory waking up from a long sleep. He moved from scales to a simple melody, an old folk song his mother used to hum to him. The notes were hesitant, full of mistakes, but the tune was there. And as he played, something began to shift inside him. The tension in his shoulders started to ease. The frantic buzzing in his mind began to quiet down. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his wife or the dinner party or the suffocating silence of the house. He was just thinking about the music. He started to play more freely, his fingers gaining confidence. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was just feeling. And then a melody he hadn't thought about in years, a melody he had written himself when he was young and full of hope and anger, came to him. He didn't have any sheet music. He didn't need it. The song was etched into his soul. He began to play. It was a complex, haunting piece, full of dark, crashing chords and soft, pleading melodies. It wasn't a perfect performance. He hit wrong notes, his timing was off in places, but it didn't matter. It was raw. It was honest. He poured all of his years of frustration, loneliness, and suppressed passion into the music. The loud, angry chords were his shame and his rage at being mocked. The soft, sad melodies were his loneliness and his grief for the man he used to be. He was telling his story, the story he could never say out loud, through the black and white keys. The sunroom filled with a storm of sound, a beautiful, chaotic storm that had been brewing inside him for a decade. He didn't know how long he played. He lost all track of time. He was lost in the music, a world he had created himself, a world where he was in control. He only stopped when his fingers were aching and his arms felt like lead. He leaned back, breathing heavily, the last notes of the melody fading into the silence. The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't an empty, accusatory silence. It was a peaceful, satisfied silence, the kind that comes after a storm has passed. Unbeknownst to him, in the house next door, an old man was sitting on his back porch, a cup of tea forgotten in his hands. He was a retired music critic, a man who had spent his life listening to the greatest musicians in the world. He valued his peace and quiet, and at first, the faint sound of piano playing had annoyed him. It was late, and the plinking notes were clumsy and disruptive. But then the music had changed. It had found a voice. He had put his book down, his professional instincts kicking in. He listened, captivated, as the music grew in complexity and power. He had heard thousands of pianists in his career, from polished virtuosos to fiery young prodigies. But this was different. This wasn't a technical performance. This was a confession. It was filled with a raw, untamed emotion that he had rarely heard before. It was the sound of a soul being laid bare, a story of profound pain and incredible resilience. He sat there in the darkness, long after the music had stopped, a single tear rolling down his cheek, stunned by the raw, beautiful, heartbreaking sound that had come from the mansion next door. The days after he first played the piano again were different. The house was the same, the silence was still there, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt like a canvas, waiting for him to fill it. Every night, long after his wife had gone to sleep, he would slip into the sunroom. He would play for hours, not for an audience, but for himself. It was a conversation with his past self, a way to heal the parts of him that had been broken. His fingers, once stiff and clumsy, grew strong and sure. The old melodies he had written came back to him, and new ones began to form, born from the well of emotion he had finally allowed himself to tap into. The music was his secret, a private world where he was not a mocked husband or a decorative accessory, but a creator. A month later, his wife announced that she was hosting the most important party of the year. The house was once again transformed into a stage for her ambitions. This time, it wasn't just a casual dinner. It was a fundraising gala for a new wing at the City Art Museum. The guest of honor was a notoriously wealthy and influential art patron, a man whose opinion could make or break careers and whose donations could build entire galleries. For weeks, the house was in chaos. Florists delivered truckloads of white lilac, caterers planned a menu of tiny, complicated food, and a lighting crew was brought in to make the art on the walls look even more expensive than it already was. His wife was a whirlwind of activity, her voice sharp with stress as she barked orders into her phone. He, as usual, was expected to be invisible, to stay out of the way and simply look handsome when required. On the night of the gala, the house was shimmering. The air was thick with the scent of lilac and expensive perfume. The city's elite mingled in the grand hall, their laughter echoing off the marble floors. He stood by the fireplace, just as he had at the dinner party, but this time he felt a strange sense of calm. He was still playing the part, but he knew he had a secret waiting for him in the sunroom. He had a world of his own now, and their opinions didn't seem to matter as much. An hour into the party, a hushed panic began to spread through the staff. He saw his wife pull the event planner aside, her face a mask of tight control. He watched as she made a frantic phone call, her voice low but urgent. When she hung up, her face was pale. The professional pianist she had hired, a man from the conservatory with a stellar reputation had been in a minor car accident. He was fine, but he wouldn't be coming. The music for the evening was gone. This was a disaster. The art patron was a known lover of music. The entire atmosphere of the evening was built around a sophisticated, classical backdrop. His wife began to pace, her perfect composure cracking. She looked like a trapped animal. The event planner was suggesting a pre-recorded playlist, an idea his wife dismissed with a look of pure horror. "This is not a teenager's birthday party," she hissed. "We cannot have a Spotify playlist for the most important cultural patron in the city." Just as the panic was reaching its peak, the doorbell rang. A moment later, the butler announced a guest, the quiet, elderly man from next door. His wife had invited him out of a sense of neighborhoodly duty, not expecting him to actually come. The old man, the retired music critic, walked slowly into the grand hall, his eyes taking in the scene with a calm, observant gaze. He overheard the frantic whispers at the check-in desk about the missing pianist. He approached his wife, who was trying to fan herself with a cocktail napkin. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said, his voice soft but clear. "It seems you have a musical emergency." His wife forced a pained smile. "You could say that. Our pianist had an accident. The evening is ruined." The old man looked thoughtful for a moment. "Perhaps not," he said slowly. "I believe you have a solution right here in this house." "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her patience worn thin. "Your husband," the old man said, his gaze unwavering. "He is a remarkably gifted pianist." His wife let out a short, incredulous laugh. It was the same sound he had heard before, a sound that used to make him shrink. But this time it just sounded sad. "My husband?" she said, glancing over at him with a look of disdain. "He's an amateur. He just plinks around in the sunroom. It's a hobby." "I have been a student of music my entire life," the old man said, his voice gaining a quiet authority. "I have heard the greats play on the world's most famous stages, and I have heard your husband play. What I heard was not plinking, it was raw, honest, and profoundly moving. He has more talent in his little finger than most of the performers you could hire." The art patron, a distinguished man with a kind face and sharp eyes, had wandered over, drawn by the conversation. He looked at the old man with interest. "Is that so?" "I'm always interested in discovering new talent." His wife was cornered. She looked from the expectant face of the patron to the calm, certain face of the old man, and then finally at him. Her eyes were a mix of desperation, disgust, and a plea. It was the most vulnerable he had ever seen her. She saw a way to save her party, but it meant handing the microphone, or in this case the piano, to the man she had spent years belittling. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth, turning to him. "You, go and play, but don't you dare embarrass me." It wasn't a request. It was a command, but it was one he was now willing to follow on his own terms. He was led to the grand piano that sat in the corner of the main hall, a sleek, black instrument that was much newer than his own. The room fell silent as he walked towards it. He could feel 100 pairs of eyes on him. He saw the pity, the curiosity, the low expectations. He sat down on the smooth leather bench. He took a deep breath, and for a moment he was terrified. The doubt came rushing back. What if the old man was wrong? What if he choked? He looked out at the crowd, but he wasn't really seeing them. His eyes found his wife standing near the bar, her arms crossed, her face a mask of anxiety. He thought of her laughter at the dinner party. He thought of the years of silence, of feeling like a ghost in his own life. Then he thought of the nights in the sunroom, the feeling of his fingers finding their way home, the music that was his and his alone. He placed his hands on the keys. They were cool and smooth. He closed his eyes. He didn't play a simple, safe tune. He didn't play a well-known classical piece that everyone would recognize. He began to play the same haunting, complex melody he had composed in the sunroom, the story of his pain and his rebirth. The first notes were hesitant, but as he sank into the music, his confidence grew. The melody filled the vast hall, not with loud, crashing noise, but with a powerful, emotional current that seemed to pull the air from the room. The music was a conversation. It spoke of loneliness, of dreams locked away, of a quiet desperation that slowly, painfully, blossomed into hope. It was angry and sad, but it was also beautiful and full of life. He wasn't just pressing keys. He was pouring 10 years of his life into the music. He was telling them everything. When he played the final, soft chord, the silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, sacred silence. No one moved, no one spoke. They were all held in the spell of the music. Then the art patron was the first to move. He slowly put his glass down and began to clap. It was a single, loud clap in the silent room, then another and another. Soon, the entire room erupted in a thunderous applause, a wave of sound so loud it seemed to shake the foundations of the house. It was real, raw applause, not the polite, chuckling kind he was used to. It was the sound of people who had been truly moved. He stood up, his heart pounding, and gave a small, shaky bow. The art patron pushed his way through the crowd and came right up to him, his eyes shining with admiration. "That was extraordinary," the patron said, his voice filled with genuine awe. "Who are you? I have never heard anything like that." Near the bar, his wife stood frozen, her champagne glass trembling in her hand so much that the liquid sloshed over the sides. She watched as the man she had mocked, the man she had dismissed as having cute little fantasies, became the center of a world she so desperately wanted to be a part of. He was receiving the praise, the admiration, the validation that she craved for herself, and he had done it with the very thing she had tried to make him ashamed of. In that moment, looking at the genuine respect on the patron's face and the proud smile on the old neighbor's face, she saw not her husband, but a stranger, a talented, powerful stranger who had just taken the stage she had built for herself and brought the house down. The applause didn't stop. It echoed in his ears, a wave of sound that washed away years of silence. People were coming up to him, not with pity or polite curiosity, but with genuine admiration. They wanted to shake his hand, to tell him how his music made them feel. For the first time in a decade, he was seen, not as the millionaire's quiet husband, but as a musician, a creator. He felt a lightness in his chest he hadn't realized he'd been missing. It was like breathing properly for the first time in years. The art patron, a man whose name was on buildings and whose opinion shaped the city's culture, stayed by his side. He dismissed the other guests with a polite but firm wave, focusing his entire attention on him. "That piece you played," the patron said, his voice filled with a deep respect. "You wrote that yourself, didn't you?" He nodded, unable to find his voice. "I thought so," the patron continued. "It has a truth to it that you can't find in sheet music. It's been a very long time since I've heard something so honest. So raw." His wife watched from a distance, her face a complicated mask of emotions. The initial shock had given way to a frantic, calculating energy. She saw the opportunity. This wasn't a disaster anymore. It was an unexpected triumph, and she needed to be a part of it. She glided over, her smile perfectly rehearsed, and slipped her arm through his. "He's always been so private about his talent," she said, her voice dripping with a false modesty. "I've been telling him for years he needed to share his gift with the world, but he's just too humble. Isn't he wonderful?" The patron gave her a polite but dismissive smile. "He is indeed. And I have a proposition for him." The patron turned back to him, ignoring the wife completely. "I have a small recording studio. A private project. I would be honored if you would let me produce an album for you. Just you and the piano. No pressure, no commercial expectations. Just a chance to capture that magic I heard tonight." He was stunned. An album? The word felt foreign, like something from another life. He looked at the patron, searching his face for any sign of a joke, but there was only sincerity. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "Say yes," the patron said, simply. In the days that followed, the house felt different. The silence was gone, replaced by a new kind of energy. His wife treated him differently, too. She was no longer dismissive. She was attentive, almost doting. She would bring him coffee in the sunroom while he practiced, asking him about his music. She talked about their project, their upcoming success. She told her friends on the phone that she had been his muse, that she had nurtured his genius in private, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal him to the world. She was trying to weave his success into the fabric of her own story, to claim it for herself. He let her talk. He didn't have the energy to fight her. His mind was elsewhere. The patron's offer had unlocked something inside him. He spent hours at the old Steinway in the sunroom, not playing out of pain or loneliness anymore, but with a sense of purpose. He was rediscovering his old compositions and writing new ones. The music was no longer a secret escape. It was a path forward. The more he played, the more he realized that the life he was living in the mansion was no longer a life he wanted. The success, the admiration, it all felt hollow if he had to share it with someone who saw it as a reflection on herself. The final straw came a week later. A reporter from a local arts magazine called, wanting to do a story on the mystery pianist who had captivated the city's elite. His wife intercepted the call and arranged for an interview at the house. When the reporter arrived, she greeted him at the door and led him into the living room, where she proceeded to give an interview as if she were the subject. She spoke of her struggle to convince her shy, reclusive husband to share his precious gift. She painted a picture of herself as a dedicated patron of the arts, a supportive wife who had single-handedly discovered and cultivated this raw talent. He stood in the doorway of the living room, listening to her spin her web of lies. He saw the reporter nodding, scribbling in his notebook, completely buying her performance. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't stay. This was her world, a world of appearances and fabrications. His world was now in the sunroom, with the dusty keys and the honest music. They could not exist in the same space. He didn't argue with her after the reporter left. He didn't confront her about the lies. He simply went into the sunroom and called the patron. "I've made a decision," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I want to do the album. But I want to do it my way. And I can't do it here." The patron understood completely. The next day he found a small, modest apartment for rent above a little music shop in the older part of the city. It was a simple space with one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a big living room with a window that looked out onto a busy street. It was perfect. It was a world away from the sterile, silent mansion he spent the afternoon packing. He didn't have much. A few clothes, some books, and a box of old photographs. The only thing that mattered was the piano. He arranged for movers to come and get it. He was standing in the sunroom, looking at the empty space where the piano had been, when his wife found him. "What is going on?" she asked, her voice sharp. She had just returned from a shopping trip, her arms laden with designer bags. She saw the single-packed box by the door and her face paled. "You're not seriously leaving?" "I am," he said quietly. "After everything I've done for you?" She said, her voice rising with a hysterical edge. "I gave you this life. I made you. And now that you're finally successful, you're just going to throw it all away?" "You didn't make me," he said, turning to look at her. He felt no anger, only a deep, quiet sadness for her. "You tried to break me." "You almost did. So this is about that stupid dinner party?" She scoffed. "Get over it." "I was just joking." "You're so sensitive." "It's not about the dinner party," he said. "It's about the 10 years of jokes that came before it. It's about the way you talk about me like I'm not even in the room. It's about the fact that when I finally found my voice again, your first instinct was to try and take credit for it." She stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. She couldn't understand. In her mind, she had given him everything. A beautiful home, security, a place in her world. She couldn't see that it was a cage because she had never been the one locked inside. "So you're leaving me for a piano?" she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a profound sense of loss. She looked small and fragile in the vast, empty room. "I'm not leaving you for a piano," he said gently. "I'm leaving so I can find myself again. The piano just showed me the way." He picked up his single box. He walked towards the door, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the sunroom, a queen in her empty, echoing kingdom. He didn't look back. He walked out of the mansion and into the bright, noisy city, a man with nothing but a box of memories and a world of music waiting to be written. The gilded cage was empty, but for the first time in his life, he was finally free.